Chapter 9 On the Wrong Side of War Again. Alfred had lived in Rothenburg his entire life of 32 years, including the years when the Führer had called all able-bodied men into service. But Alfred was not a normal, able-bodied man. A heart condition he'd had from birth and a malformed leg as a result of a childhood accident had prevented him from serving in the Wehrmacht. He was often torn between the shame of not having served and the relief he felt, particularly now that the once mighty Third Reich was so obviously in its death throes. As a boy, Alfred had been nicknamed Freddy by family and friends. He hadn't minded it so much as a young boy, but as a grown man, he felt belittled when someone hailed him by that moniker, as if not serving in the army hadn't emasculated him enough. He had to bear the insult of being called by a child's name. Even though his hometown had often evaded the destruction of war throughout history and had done so throughout the current war, things were now grim. Nearby Nuremberg had been flattened by Allied bombers. German troops that had been stationed there and had managed to survive the bombardment had fled where they could. Some of them sought refuge in tiny Rothenburg. Somehow, the American military found out where they were located and began bombing the town. The walled community had been built to withstand horse-mounted troops and the occasional cannonball, but the stone walls were no match for the airborne bombers or the ordnance of American tanks. Unlike larger German towns such as Nuremberg, there were no mass underground shelters where citizens could hide until the all-clear signals alerted them that it was relatively safe to venture above ground. In Rothenburg, one had to seek shelter wherever it could be found and hope that it would suffice. That was how Alfred found himself in the old hand-dug cellar of a bombed-out building not far from his home. He had fled there based on the logic that if the Americans had already bombed the building, they probably wouldn't hit it again. Why would they waste the ammunition? It may not have been foolproof logic, but it was better than standing unprotected in the street. Fortunately, there was enough of the flooring above the cellar to shelter him from the rain. The foundation walls were damaged, but provided some protection against the wind and kept him out of sight from above. So he huddled in his hovel to wait out the bombing. The Americans wouldn't bomb a place like Rothenburg at night. It was too small and poorly lit. So he knew that if he could wait things out until dark, he might be able to venture out again. Waiting alone was hard enough when you had a good book or some music to listen to. Even a comfortable chair would make waiting more tolerable. But Alfred sat alone on a pile of rubble with no comfort in sight. His eyes searched the bombed-out cellar in hopes of finding something of interest, or at least an old bottle of schnapps or wine that would help him pass the time. After a few minutes, his eyes came to rest on what looked like a trunk or some kind of storage case. It was covered with dust and debris from the bombing, but it was still intact, despite being obviously very old. As he crawled toward the container, his hopes ran toward finding the bottle of schnapps. After prying off the top of the crate, he found clothing and cloth and a few ancient household items. But then his hopes were rewarded. He found an old bottle of schnapps at the bottom of the box. Pulling it out, he managed to open it with the knife he had in his pocket. After a careful sniff and a tentative sip, He was pleased to find that the contents had not gone off. There was no marking on the bottle to indicate how old it was, but it tasted fine to him. After a few sips, Alfred began wondering what else was in the crate. Careful not to make too much noise or to make movements that might be seen from above, he gently rummaged through the contents. He finally found a leather folder that contained parchments covered in handwriting that used the old German script. He realized it was a diary of sorts, but it wasn't clear who had written it. He started to read the few pages that were there and softly whistled when he saw the date on the top of the first page. October 1631. His hands trembled just a bit as he realized he was looking at a record of what had happened in Rothenburg during the 30 Years' War. Some of the pages were cracked with edges missing. Some places were fire damaged and others had obviously been soaked with water, perhaps in an attempt to put out the fire that damaged the pages. It was still possible to read some of the remarks. Rothenburg finds itself in a perilous situation. This cursed war that has caused Protestants and Catholics to take up arms against one another has visited us at last. Troops of the Catholic army, under the command of General Tilly, were passing through the region. They had no interest in our small town, having just won a great battle, rumor has it, in Magdeburg. They were heading south to warmer climes to wait out the winter. It was not fated to be so. Torrential rains have drenched the area for a week. The wheels of their wagons and cannons are stuck in mud up to the axles. As a result, they are stranded virtually outside our gates. This is not good news. Damage to the parchment prevented Alfred from reading more of that particular entry, but the story continued on another page. It is as we feared. Tilly's army cannot pass by. The weather has grown cold, and they are short on supplies. They have sent an envoy demanding that we open our gates to them and provide them with everything they need to remain here until winter passes. The matter has been taken to the town council. For once, the council and the townspeople are in agreement. We all know that simply providing food, drink, and beds to the army will not be the end of the story. Their overwhelming numbers alone, some estimate that there may be as many as 40,000 of them, will ruin us in a matter of weeks. But we also know how these mercenaries behave. For them, this is not a war about religion. It is an opportunity to enrich themselves by plundering our homes and shops. But they won't be satisfied even with that. They will take our wives and daughters and do to them whatever they will. Anyone who opposes them will be cut to shreds. I have it on good authority that the town council voted unanimously to reject this call to open our gates. Every citizen agrees that it is better to defend our town as long as we can. We have strong walls surrounding us. We have munitions. We have enough food stored up to resist a siege for months, or until Tilly's army is forced by starvation and cold to move on. Another page contained yet another entry from the unknown writer. Rothenburg is under siege. The council's response to Tilly has unsurprisingly resulted in an enraged attack upon the town. I will have little chance to record more. Every citizen has been called upon to protect this town. We have some 1,000 men stationed on the wall around the city to repel advances. We have ample munitions and food. We are not professional soldiers, but we hold a certain advantage. I, too, must do my part. I may be older and somewhat feeble. I have sustained injuries from my work that keep me off the wall, but I will do my part to protect this town. There was a gap of a day or two before the narrative picked up again. The tone, however, was decidedly different. Rothenburg has fallen. We held out for 3 days. We probably could have lasted quite a while longer, but we were stricken with the most unfortunate series of events. None of us were soldiers, but we all tried to do our part. My old friend Helmut was tasked with ensuring that our supply of gunpowder stayed safe and dry. Helmut was a good and honest man, but he was never the cleverest of the bunch. He faithfully checked on the status of the powder, making sure no unauthorized persons came near it. If anything, he was overzealous. He decided to make one last round one night before retiring. He went after dark to make sure everything was secure. When he tested the door leading into the storage area, it was unlocked. No one will ever know whether Helmut left it unlocked after his last inspection, or if one of the men responsible for loading the cannons had forgotten to secure the door. It doesn't matter. Unnerved by finding the door unlocked, Helmut opened it and went inside to inspect, without thinking about the fact that he held a flaming torch in his hand. The resulting explosion not only destroyed our entire supply of gunpowder, but it also blasted a massive breach in the wall. Within minutes, Tilly's troops poured through the opening with no one to stop them. It was obvious that a gap of significant time ensued before the mysterious writer added a final comment to his tale. This will be my last entry. Tilly's soldiers go from door to door, entering whenever and wherever they wish. They loot houses without warning, taking what they want. Anyone who stands up to them is slaughtered. There is no justice. And they have brought the Black Death with them. Already, hundreds of our citizens have died from the disease. But I must take care. I cannot afford to be found with any record of these events. This kind of thing enrages them, and there is but one result that comes from that. How will Rothenburg survive? Farewell. Alfred was overwhelmed as he read the last of these words. How indeed would Rothenburg survive? Rothenburg had rebuilt after the destruction of the 30 Years' War. It had somehow scraped by, but without a shred of its former glory intact. It still looked largely the same as it had during the war described in the journal, at least until a few days ago. It had become a small and forgotten town for the most part. Yes, the romantic artists had reminded the world of its bygone beauty, but that was hardly enough to make it great again. And now it faced total annihilation. Rothenburg faced a foe who could in minutes do what Tilly's army could not have accomplished in weeks or months. Alfred thought of the man from more than 300 years ago who had written the words he just read. Like Alfred, he had struggled physically, but he had done what he could. Somehow that gave Alfred a glimmer of hope. He also smiled ruefully at the thought that this wasn't the first time that Rothenburg had found herself on the wrong side of a war. He thought for a moment about some countries such as the United States, who always seemed to come out on the right side. But then he realized that they really hadn't been around that long. Perhaps their time was still coming. It suddenly occurred to him that the bombing had ceased. There was an odd silence in the streets, and he realized that the bombing had stopped some time ago, as he had been so engrossed in reading the report from his fellow citizen from 300 years ago. It wasn't until several weeks later that he found out what happened. On Easter Sunday, a German general and his troops had left battered Nuremberg for Rothenburg. Defiant to the end, the general gave orders that the town would be defended against the oncoming Americans to the last man. It didn't take long for that order to be tested. 2 days after Easter, on March 31st, 1945, the town was attacked by 16 American bombers who unloaded their payloads on the medieval town. The destruction was devastating. 39 people were killed. More than 300 houses were destroyed, along with 6 public buildings, 9 of the town's ancient towers, and more than 2,000 feet of the historic wall that still surrounded the town. This was the attack that had sent Alfred fleeing to the cellar. But the bombing had suddenly stopped. Word of the attack had reached U.S. Deputy Secretary of State General John McCloy. McCloy was familiar with the historic importance and beauty of Rothenburg and had a great fondness for the city. He then sent word through the local commander, General Jacob L. Devers, that the city should be spared further bombing if the German troops staying there would agree to leave, and the citizens would guarantee that Rothenburg would not be used as a base for further resistance. Knowing that the war was all but over, the interim commander of the German troops agreed to the proposal and left, surrendering the town on April 17th. American forces occupied the town. Much of the town lay in rubble, but significant portions of it survived intact. Rothenburg had survived once again. But how does a town in ruins, with no visible resources, go about rising from the ashes of war? The citizens of Rothenburg did the only thing that made sense. They asked for help. Thanks to the romantic painters and poets, Rothenburg had become well known around the world. The idyllic beauty of the town touched the hearts of people across the globe. The citizens of Rothenburg appealed to those hearts. They simply described the devastation and reminded the citizens of the world of the beauty that had once been Rothenburg. They proposed that people could donate a certain amount of money to restore the wall around the town. For their donations, the people's names would be imprinted in blocks on the wall. The citizens of the world responded generously. The wall around Rothenburg was restored, and to this day, you can read the names of people from North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and countless other areas who contributed to the rebuilding of this unique town. Rothenburg may have found itself on the wrong side of a war several times, but Rothenburg still lives and thrives. But if you really want to see what that means, you'll have to visit this walled town yourself.